singing at the same time on that song, and that was beautiful. That was really, really awesome to just wait for my part in the very last and just hear everybody else sing. But it's good to see everyone this morning, especially if you're visiting. We're glad that you're here and a part of this service. This is a special time for us that we get to enjoy week after week, where we share a meal with our Lord and with our Savior. We do believe that He is here and present with us because He is risen and He is ascended to the right hand of the Father, and His Spirit is now with us. And so we hope that you get to enjoy that as well this morning, and we're glad that you're here. How do you deal with regret? Not to get so personal right off the bat, but how do you deal with regret? There was a study back in 2016 that found it's like 90% of people have at least one major regret in their life. And these regrets range all over the place. Some of them had to do with education, wishing they had completed college or taken a different path, or some people it had to do with career choices, wish they would have gone into a different field or pursued a different route up the ladder or different things like that. Others had to do with family, with finding a love interest and raising a family, and the decisions that come with that sometimes come with deep regret, and it ranged all over the place. But 90% reported at least one major regret. And what's also interesting about that is these weren't just regrets of action. What they actually found is it's most common that regrets take the form of inaction. It's things that people wish they would have done and didn't. Can you relate to that at all this morning? There are some people who just kind of confidently stride through life without ever looking back over their shoulder. There's some people who at least claim to have no regrets. In fact, I saw, this is kind of a funny, I saw this this tattoo that said NOREGERTS, no regrets. And it's like, well, congratulations, you just earned your first one right there. But that's kind of how it is, right? Even when we say we don't have any regrets, it's like, yeah, it's kind of tattooed all over you. We have these deep regrets. And while some of us, maybe there's that 10% of us that do walk confidently through life and don't look back over their shoulder, 90% of us, the vast majority of us, experience regret to various degrees. And sometimes it's just the small things, right? You wish you would have taken a different route than Scottsville. You wish you would have ordered something different at the restaurant after church on Sunday. You wish you would have gone and gotten your hair cut at a different place because you don't like the way that it looks. Things like that. Sometimes it's just these small, daily, weekly regrets. But other times it's the kind of things that really keep you up at night. It's the things where, I don't know if you do this, maybe I'm weird and the only one, but you close your eyes at night and the day kind of runs back through your mind. This isn't every night, but the day kind of runs back through your mind, and you start to think about all these things that you did throughout the day and all the things that you wish you would not have done or wish you had done. Right? Why did I say that thing? Why did I go to that thing? Why did I act this way to that person? How did they perceive it? All these questions swirl through our mind, and we start to spiral, maybe even out of control, and we feel this regret. And then there's the kind of regret that seems to go into a whole other level where it seeps down into our soul. And these are the kind of regrets where we don't just think about how perhaps we've let ourselves down or we've let other people down. We imagine how we've let God down, how we've disappointed God in some way. And that is the one that breaks us the most. It reminds me of what David said in Psalm 51 in verse 4. He says, "Against you and you alone have I sinned." And of course, you know that situation. You know, in that sin with Bathsheba and everything that surrounded it, he had sinned against so many people. He had so many regrets in that moment. But as he reflects in this prayer, as he reflects in all of that time, the one thing that's weighing most heavily on his soul is this: against you alone have I sinned. That's his regret. And so to various degrees, we experience regret daily, weekly, annually, and some of those are the major regrets that seem to stick with us for a lifetime. But what I want to see this morning is how Jesus helps us to deal with regret, and how coming and sharing in this meal, coming around the table and sharing this meal with Jesus is a way for us to deal with regret. Maybe not to totally remove it, maybe not to totally never think about it again, but for over time, this meal to be the place where our deepest regrets rise to the surface, not to be shamed, but to be healed. And so John chapter 21 is where we'll pick up. And there in John 21, beginning in verse 15, John 21:15 says this. It says, when they had finished breakfast, this is Jesus and his disciples, there beside the Sea of Galilee, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Feed my lambs." And he said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And he said to him, "Tend my sheep." And then Jesus said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And it says Peter was grieved because he said to him a third time, "Do you love me?" And Peter said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." Then verse 18, "Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted, but when you are old, you'll stretch out your hands and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go." And this he said to show what kind of death through which he was to glorify God. And after saying this, Jesus said to Peter, "Follow me." Have you ever wondered what this story is doing here in John's gospel? Why we have this scene? You know, all the other gospels end with kind of these like incredible climactic moments, right? Mark ends with the women discovering the empty tomb and running back to tell the disciples. Matthew's gospel, of course, ends with that great commission: go into all the world, make disciples of all the nations. And Luke ends with the ascension, Jesus going to the right hand of the Father. All of these other gospels have these climactic moments, these climactic endings to them. But here in John's gospel, in this sort of epilogue, they're just hanging out beside the sea, sharing a meal. And so what is this story doing here? And I think at least two things. One of the things that I think is pretty neat, this is kind of cool, this acts as kind of a bookend to John's gospel. The first and the last thing that Jesus does with his disciples is share a meal with them. And I think that's pretty cool. I think that's a really neat thing, a way to kind of bookend John's gospel. The first and last thing Jesus does is just have a meal with his disciples. But more than that, do you remember what happened the night that Jesus was betrayed? First of all, Peter makes this incredible statement where he essentially says, "Lord, I know you said one of them's going to betray you, but that is not me. I'm with you to prison and to death. I'll go anywhere. I'll die for you. I'm your right-hand man. I'm going to be here no matter what, to the end." And then Jesus looks at him and he says, "Before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. And I don't know how Peter took that. I imagine it probably stung in the moment. And I imagine his thoughts begin to race. How could this possibly happen? How could this possibly be? I would never do that. But I imagine also knowing what we do know about Peter, maybe even took it as a challenge of sorts. Okay, Jesus thinks this of me, but I'm gonna prove to him that I'm faithful and loyal to the end. And he actually kind of does that, right? They're in the Garden of Gethsemane. They see the mob coming from a distance. They can see them making their way all the way from Jerusalem into the garden. And Peter the whole way is thinking, now's my chance. I'm going to prove myself. And they get there. And what does he do? Pulls out a sword, tries to chop the guy's head off, misses, gets his ear. And Peter's ready to go. And Peter's ready to prove his loyalty and commitment to Jesus. And even after that, when all the other disciples run and they forsake him and flee, Peter is at least following from a distance, following closely, thinking perhaps even, how can I get him out of this situation? Who knows? Or maybe he's so struck with fear at this moment. Maybe he's just paralyzed and can't help but watch, almost like watching some kind of train wreck where he just can't look away. He has to follow. He has to pursue. And so he's at least following, he's at least faithful to some extent, but then he gets to the courtyard of the high priest. And he's around this fire, not unlike the fire that they eat beside when he's at the Sea of Galilee. But they're around this fire, and a servant girl comes up. And you remember she pretty much accuses him. She said, I think you were with him. I think you were one of his disciples. And he says, no. He kind of downplays it. No, that's you're mistaken. I'm not with this man. I don't know this man. And then a little while later, another servant comes up and he says, no, I think you were with him. I'm pretty sure I saw that you were also with Jesus. And he says a little more adamantly, listen, no, you don't know what you're talking about. I do not know this man. And then finally later, another person comes up, and this time it seems like he is more persistent and adamant than before, saying, no, you're a Galilean. I can tell. You must have been one of his disciples. You must have been with Jesus. And this time Peter, I imagine, frustrated and worried and both afraid, begins to adamantly protest, saying, I swear I don't know this man. I swear I have nothing to do with him. And it says that as he was still speaking, as he was still in the midst of denying Jesus, of disowning Jesus, it says immediately the rooster crowed. And then it says, Jesus turned and looked at Peter. He turned and looked at Peter. Can you imagine how Peter would have felt in that moment? Can you imagine the regret that would have weighed so heavily on his soul? I don't know all of what went through Peter's mind, but it says this in Luke 22 and verse 62. It says, he went out and he wept bitterly. He went out and he wept bitterly. Now we know how the story ends. Jesus comes back and everything is okay and it's all great and fine. But it's almost like something is still off with Peter. And I kind of imagine as if Jesus comes back and there's this joy and excitement just like Jesus promised there would be. But then Peter, maybe no one else can pick up on it. Maybe no one else notices, but deep within himself, he feels off. He feels like there's something not quite right. And what that thing is the regret. He still knows that there's something off in this relationship. There's still this tension between he and Jesus that has not been resolved. And so while everybody else is celebrating, he still feels off. And maybe you know what that's like. Maybe you know what it's like to even come here and come around this table and you experience this feeling of something's not quite right. We all know that feeling of when things aren't quite right with us, because we are not quite right with God. And so what does Jesus do? Well, Jesus, he invites him to share in this meal. And he asks him a question. And the question that Jesus asks is not, how could you do this? The question is not, what were you thinking? The question is not, how are you going to make this right? How are you going to make up for this utter failure that you've made? No, instead, the question is simply this: do you love me? And Peter, at first, he says, Lord, you know I love you. And then he asks him again, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And then he asks a third time, do you love me? And then Peter gets it. He gets it. He sees exactly what Jesus is doing. And it crushes him. All the regret rushes back to the surface. And he is hurt and he is broken by this. But Jesus, he brings our regrets to the surface, not to be shamed, but to be healed. And so, Peter, experiencing this moment with Jesus, as all this regret rushes back to the surface, Peter humbly but adamantly says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. You know that I love you. And with those words, Peter's deepest regret is redeemed. And while so much more could be said about this story, there's so many good lessons that could come from this. I want to close with this. 90% of people have at least one major regret in their life, and 90% of people have no idea what to do with it. We struggle to know what to do with our regret. And often all we can hear is the voice of the accuser saying, why did you do that? What were you thinking? How could you do this thing? This is unforgivable. You can't, how could you have possibly made this mistake? How are you going to make this right? How are you going to make up for this? And that's the voice, the persistent voice that we often hear with our regret. And maybe that's the voice that you hear this morning. But the good news is, just like Peter, Jesus has invited us to share in this meal. And all that Jesus wants to know is, do you love me? Jesus doesn't want an explanation. Jesus certainly doesn't want our excuses to try and explain this away. But you know what Jesus also doesn't want? Jesus doesn't want us to be ridden with regret. Jesus doesn't want us to be stuck in the sorrow of sin. And so whatever your regret is this morning, let your regrets rise to the surface. Don't tuck them away. Don't pretend that they're not there. Don't try to absolve them on your own. This morning, let your regrets rise to the surface. But as you do that, don't listen to the voice of the accuser. Listen to the voice of the advocate. Listen to the voice of Jesus saying, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And keep listening to that voice as we partake until you, like Peter, can humbly but adamantly say, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. We'll now ask the men to come forward as we partake this morning.